But the savagery unfortunately didn't end there. As night began to fall, the men had become hungry, and they had decided that David would be their next meal. Hello and welcome to episode 25 of Makeup and Mayhem, True Crime with me, your host, Bella Monsoon. I know you all missed last week's episode, that was clear from the messages I received, but man, things have been absolutely manic this side. So for those of you who don't follow me on any other social media platforms, I run a couple of small businesses in different fields, but they all entail retail and e-commerce. So this time of year is always my busiest. So I had to take a little break last week to avoid burnout because let me tell you, that ish is real and super rough. But never fear, I am back, and today's case is one that you probably haven't heard of, but man, oh man, is it a nightmare trip, both literally and figuratively. So, as I've mentioned in the previous few episodes, I am trying different things out with the channel, testing different things, and seeing the response. So today's episode contains some pretty dark, nitty-gritty details, which YouTube is not such a fan of. So for those of you who are interested, I'll be posting the uncut version to my Patreon account. So I will be speaking about the full case here on YouTube. However, if you want to get into the nitty-gritty details, the not so safe for YouTube content, then that will be on the video that is posted on my Patreon account. So if this proves to be a useful avenue to pursue in the future, I would like to start creating Patreon only bonus content. But never fear, I will still be posting my content here on YouTube. Becoming a patron on my Patreon account would just basically be a way for you to support my channel, my research, and what I do, as well as allowing me the space to post more adult-themed content and facts regarding each case and episode that YouTube is not such a fan of. There are also some pretty cool perks and privileges for my patrons, so if you're keen to read more about it, you can just check out the link I have added into the description box to go to my Patreon page. But enough of that. For those of you who are new, let me introduce myself. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm a mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with makeup, true crime, and uncovering the motives that drive people to do what they do. So what this means is that every single week I post a brand new video that looks at a real life crime from a psychological viewpoint. And every alternate week I also complete a super easy to follow makeup look whilst I discuss these cases. During these episodes I also try to share psychological knowledge and concepts that you may or may not be aware of in an easy to understand format. So if all of that sounds like it is just up your alley, then please consider subscribing and joining the Ballaboo family. If you're more a fan of podcasts, it's okay, I won't be offended, but I will direct you over to my podcast, Murder and Mayhem, a South African true crime podcast, which is an immersive 3D sound experience. I'm going to leave it at that. If you're interested, give it a listen for yourself. It is available on all major streaming channels. Just a quick disclaimer for today's episode. Today's story contains material citing assault and murder. I have a list of mental health resources which you can find on my website bellamonsoon.com. As always, I mean absolutely no disrespect to the victims nor their families. The purpose of this video is purely to shed further light on the series of heinous crimes that were committed, whilst spreading awareness about the psychological nature of the narrative. This story has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes real-life accounts, footage, and images where available of and from individuals who were involved directly in the case. So for today's episode, as opposed to last week's cases that we discussed, which you can find here, we're heading back to 1991. And just a quick side note, due to the fact that these crimes took place about 30 years ago, there aren't very many photos available. Our story begins with Anthony Lawrence Johannes Wessels. And honestly, there wasn't very much publicly available information about him. We do know that his father, Anthony Lawrence Wessels, yes, same name, allegedly was a murderer. He had apparently killed a 66-year-old man, Barney Uranowski, as well as his 55-year-old wife, Fanny, in Turfontein in 1962. This is according to Wessels' mother. His mother was heavily into spiritualism, and she also believed in poltergeists. He also later claimed that his stepfather and stepbrother sexually abused him in his adolescent years. So as an adult, he became a railway policeman, and he resided in Johannesburg. And just looking at him, he was quite intimidating. He was a big man with a bald head and apparently quite a strong body odor. Those weren't my words. And at the time of this crime spree beginning, he was 30 years old. And on the other end of it, Jean-Pierre Havinger was a teenager. He was 16 years old. He was apparently well-built and attractive. And there's even less information about him, besides the fact that he was from Durban. The two had met one night in a gay bar. They had hit it off almost instantaneously, and soon after, they had become lovers. They also soon became partners in crime, developing money-making schemes with added sexual benefits. From that point on, they traveled all across the country in their less than savory and sanitary car, which also doubled as their home on the nights when they didn't have enough money to book in to a hotel. Their targets were homosexual men, who they believed to be soft targets, easy to intimidate, vulnerable, and more than likely to not say anything after the fact. Keep in mind, this is the 90s in apartheid South Africa that we're talking about. It's really not known exactly how many victims they may have had, as the crimes that I will discuss in this episode are the only crimes that they ended up confessing to. Whether or not there were more victims, we can't know. What we do know is that it was a collaborative effort of a team of detectives and the infamous Piet Bielefeld that led to the arrest and conviction of this killer couple. So today I'm going to tell this case in a slightly different way, kind of from the end to the beginning, in a way. So let's head to Johannesburg, in particular the Boxberg Hotel, to start the sordid tale. The two men, Anthony and Jean-Pierre, sit casually having a few drinks and chatting by the bar. Chatting about a murder they committed in Knysna. A waiter, shocked at what he's hearing, decides to call the police. And shortly afterwards, the couple are arrested by Piet Bielefeld and a team of detectives. Their vehicle was also taken to the Brixton forensic team, who searched it for possible DNA evidence. And after searching their car, 3 knives, an axe, and a revolver are found. It turns out that one of the officers who were instrumental in their arrest had actually been tracking and tracing them for a period of time since one of their victims' bodies had actually been found. But more on that in a little while. So now they had been taken back to the Boxberg police station, and it was here that Anthony started getting quite aggressive, and he was threatening Piet Bielefeld, saying that he would kill him if he touched him. Jean-Pierre, on the other hand, was taken into separate questioning, and it wasn't too long before he broke down, burst into tears, and spilled the proverbial beans. At this point, after Anthony heard about his lover's confession, he became extremely agitated. In a strange twist, he had then broken down and began sobbing like a baby, which was apparently quite a sight to behold, given the fact that he had portrayed himself as such a terrifying presence to begin with. The couple themselves, after further interrogation, of which they were held separately, then ended up spilling the entire sordid tale of their criminal escapade. Thus began the most macabre road trip you can ever imagine, with the couple pointing out all of their murder crime scenes across the country. During this time, they were also taken in separate vehicles to avoid any colluding and influence between the two. The first stop was Knysna, and the scene of Edward Perlmutter's murder. Edward Perlmutter was a 24-year-old American student who had decided to hitchhike across Africa in 1991. Prior to leaving, he had an understanding with his parents that he would phone them once a week to let them know where he was and where he was going. However, when his parents didn't hear from him for 2 weeks, they contacted the Knysna Police Department, as this was the last known location that he was supposedly heading to. Knysna is a beautiful town along the coast between the borders of the eastern and western provinces in South Africa. It's an area full of extensive forests and gorgeous coastal landmarks. It later came to light that he had disappeared on the Outeniqua hiking trail near George in October of 1991, with his disappearance making headlines worldwide. A couple had seen his face in the local newspapers and they had recognized him. They came forward saying that they had met him whilst hiking on the trail, and the three of them had spent the night in Millwood House. The next morning, he had left quite early and he had told them that he would go ahead on the trail and he would wait for them at the end. However, when they reached the end of the trail, they didn't see him and they had just assumed that he had moved on without them. So the area to search was quite vast, as we're talking about extensive forests and mountainsides. But after searching for a few days, a search party with some sniffer dogs went out, and by pure chance and wind direction, they stumbled upon Edward's decomposing body. Twigs and branches were neatly packed over his body in a diagonal pattern. According to forensics, he had died on the 25th of October, 1991. It was at this point that the detectives on the case mentioned that they had seen two locals who really didn't appear to fit in, as they had been dressed all in black. According to the couple who had last seen Edward, these two men had also apparently stolen food from them the night before Edward went missing. Warrant Officer Olivier then began his investigations into the men, which would ultimately culminate in their arrest at the Boxberg Hotel. And for those of you who are just curious, Millwood Hut is kind of a camping spot. Since these trails are incredibly extensive, they can sometimes take days to complete. You need to kind of stop and break your trip up, and you're kind of in the middle of the forest, so there's nowhere else to really camp. So now we head back to the road trip and the parties who have just arrived in Knysna. Whilst walking the path near Millwood Hut, Bailiffeld and the team of detectives hear firsthand from the couple what happened to Edward that fateful day in October. The pair had actually seen Edward the previous day, but for reasons unbeknownst to us, they had decided to lay in wait and get him rather the following day. They had stood waiting further down the footpath when Edward had approached, singing and completely unaware of the danger his life was in. They had first demanded his backpack, which he had willingly given them. However, once they had the backpack, they had still overpowered him, tied his hands behind his back, and ended his life. As he continued to fight for his life and thrash up and down, they had sat on his body in an attempt to stop him from attracting attention from hikers on a nearby trail. Apparently, they had planned to just rob him, but somehow they had killed him instead. Yeah, that doesn't sound very likely. So if you know anything about hiking trails, and in particular hiking trails in Knysna, you will know there are tons of trails that go through the same areas, but the forests are incredibly dense, and there are honestly spots that are so isolated there isn't even phone signal. After they were done, Anthony and Jean-Pierre had then left his body to decompose, which it did fairly quickly in the humid forest. The couple alleged that they did not sexually assault him. However, there is no evidence to confirm that they were telling the truth in this regard. I also say this because his underpants were found hanging from a tree nearby. The rest of his clothing was found under some bushes, with his sneakers placed neatly next to one another. It turned out that the couple had stayed with the satanic high priest in Knysna after the murder. Anthony was quite interested allegedly in the occult and aligned with Satanism. an interest that perhaps was cultivated by the beliefs that his mother held growing up. Regardless, the pair had also used false names and they had stolen money from him too, before leaving the following day. With this initial revelation and findings, this disturbing road trip had moved on to the next destination, Drakensberg. Drakensberg is one of the most beautiful places in South Africa. It has rolling mountains, gorgeous valleys, and thick, dense brush forests, which unfortunately was the perfect setting for the murder of the teenage boy David Semmel. David Semmel had lost his parents when he was a young child. After his adoptive parents had also died, he was placed in the care of a foster family, but ended up bouncing around from home to home. He ended up at Excelsior Place of Safety for Juveniles. This is a government organization that serves to accommodate boys in conflict from the ages of 13 to 17 years old. According to some research and articles that I found, David and Jean-Pierre had actually been in this organization together, which is where they initially met. It is, however, unclear at which point in time Jean-Pierre had left and met up with Anthony. However, what is known is that in September of 2000, David had run away from Excelsior Place of Safety. He was standing on the roadside in Durban when Anthony and Jean-Pierre's vehicle had pulled over and picked him up. And so was the beginning of his end, as they began the drive to Drakensberg. A few hours later, the three of them had stopped near a hiking path. So once they had parked their vehicle, they had then began to walk deeper into the mountains. So as I mentioned, the Drakensberg is well renowned for its lush vegetation and its deep forests and gorgeous mountainsides. So they began to climb some slopes, they walked further on, and they eventually pitched their tent on the banks of a stream in Deep Kloof near Giant's Castle. It was here that David's worst nightmare had begun. He was assaulted by first Anthony and then Jean-Pierre. When the pain and torture was finally over, he was then strangled by Anthony, who used 2 shoestrings to do the job. But the savagery unfortunately didn't end there. As night began to fall, the men had become hungry, and they had decided that David would be their next meal. And they had done this super casually, as though it was just another piece of meat that they had purchased in a grocery store. And that's precisely how the couple had viewed this entire situation. David was just meat to them, and they were hungry. No emotion, no remorse, no sense of disgust in their actions. They had then buried his body in the shallowest of graves. So as this gruesome tale was being told to them, Bielefeld and his team were hiking up to this isolated spot. Upon finally reaching the campsite, they had found David scattered in multiple parts. These were then collected and placed into a bag. Keep in mind, this was an incredibly dense forest, there were wild animals, and he was placed in a very shallow grave to begin with. Bielefeld had then instructed Anthony and Jean-Pierre to carry the body down the hike back to the vehicles. The location of David's body was said to be so isolated that it would more than likely have never been found if they hadn't been led there. Back in Estcourt, about an hour's drive from Drakensberg, hair and forensic samples were taken in an attempt to identify and confirm the victim's identity. From this point, the road trip resumed, and the next murder scene on the map was in Pretoria. This time, the victim was Jacob Petrus Joubert, 47 years old and a retired Defence Force major, whom the couple had actually met in a hotel. He had then invited the pair back to his flat in Tullochen Place, Berea Park. It is here that Anthony alleges that Jacob had come on to Jean-Pierre, which Anthony had not appreciated, and this had enraged him. Anthony had then ended his life. They had strangled him and drowned him. His body was found naked on his back in his bathtub. Evidence also later showcased that his nose had been bitten. The pair had also wrote the words "F the whites" on a wall in his home in an attempt to confuse the police. Keep in mind, this is apartheid era still. After leaving him floating in bloody water in the bath, the couple had taken all the money they could find and left the apartment. This was a murder that they seemed so proud of when speaking about, as though they were great heroes and had pulled off some amazing feat. And they weren't done there. The last victim, Clive Newman, an Anglican priest from Port Elizabeth, was also the only victim known to survive. He had been left for dead by the pair on the beach at Blue Water Bay on the 12th of November 1991. He had survived and miraculously had recovered, but just 18 years later, he had actually been murdered in Grahamstown. Completely unrelated to this case, though. And that murder in itself is a bizarre case and story. I literally read the article and I was like, what? But I will leave it in the description box if you want to check it out for yourself. But yeah, so after the disturbing road trip had ended, everybody had returned to Brixton and the pair were kept in separate holding cells. Bielefeld was worried that Anthony might snap and kill Jean-Pierre, as Jean-Pierre was the first to confess. Unable to see or be with his lover, Anthony threatened to commit suicide. However, the trial proceeded, they were taken to book, and in the Cape Town Supreme Court, the judge found them both guilty. Newman, the last victim who had survived, his testimony was vital in their conviction too. A few moments after the verdict was read, Anthony had shouted at Bielefeld that he was going to kill him when he got out of prison one day. Yeah, buddy, that ain't happening. Well, maybe it might, but more on that later. On the 2nd of December 1992, Judge President Gerald Friedman sentenced Anthony Wessels to death. However, in 1994, the death penalty was abolished. And so his sentence was amended to lifelong imprisonment. Jean-Pierre, being a minor at the time, he wasn't even 18 years old yet, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. So currently, where are we at? 30 years after the last murder. The couple split up, but that's not really much of a surprise. This is usually the pattern in most couples who kill after conviction. And, well, Jean-Pierre, he's kind of out of jail. I'm not sure exactly what he's doing, but he's a free man. Well, in the sense that he's not confined to a cell any longer. He is on parole under correctional supervision in Pretoria. It's also reported that during his time in prison, he turned to religion. Anthony, on the other hand, is apparently still interested in the occult. He was eligible for parole in 2015, however, there was much outcry to him being released, particularly from the family of Edward Perlmutter, the American victim. Edward's brother, Gary, had said, "Freeing this monster would be like placing a nuclear bomb on a playground. There is no doubt in my mind that given the opportunity, he would go back to his murderous ways." Edward's father, Joseph, who was 80 years old at the time of the 2015 article, said that their son's murder had left them devastated and emotionally scarred. He had went on to say, "There is not an hour in any day that we are not yearning for our son. It has been 24 years since Eddie was murdered, and the pain and longing remain so fresh and strong. It often feels like 24 minutes. Where is the truth in sentencing when a prisoner who received a death sentence and several life imprisonment sentences can be paroled in 24 or 25 years? I mean, Joseph does make an incredibly valid point, but that is a discussion for another day. So what is the psychological deal with killer couples? Well, this isn't the first couple I've discussed on my channel, and I'm pretty sure it won't be the last either. Probably my most watched case is the South African killer couple from Welkom. That episode really delved into the dynamics at play in killer couple cases. And once again, I touched on this with Gert van Rooyen and Joey Hardhoff, and most recently in South Africa's own Bonnie and Clyde, Charmaine Phillips and Pieter Grinling. So yeah, it seems like killer couples are way more common than you think. The dynamic between Antony and Jean-Pierre was more evident and easier to understand, just simply looking at it. Antony was a dominant figure who exerted much power, influence, and thus control over Jean-Pierre. Jean-Pierre, having a difficult childhood and not even being an adult himself, was in a vulnerable position, and this was ultimately exploited by Antony. Now, I'm going to stop right there before you say, well, Bella, he's still complicit though. Because yes, I 100% agree with you. He may have been influenced, but he still took an active part in the murders, and thus he is 100% responsible and complicit for the role that he played. The relationship between Antony and Jean-Pierre is what is termed a parasitic relationship. Antony was more of a draining, controlling force on Jean-Pierre. This is often the case with many serial killer relationships. One party is more submissive, and ultimately this is how it functions optimally. Once a pair or couple are involved in a murder, often one cannot pull out for fear of the other. And so the rampage continues. Antony did not have a great childhood either, which ultimately led to him becoming the man that he did. Subjected to consistent abuse throughout his childhood, he viewed the world through a different lens than perhaps you or I. During the trial, the clinical psychologist who testified, Leslie Stone, firstly stated that Antony was one of the most bizarre and dangerous murderers that he had ever come across. Antony held the belief that his victims' souls bonded with his at the time of their deaths. He further implied that Antony's psychopathic traits were more personality-based, thus less likely to fundamentally change in the future. In South Africa, we also do not have programs specialized towards serial killer rehabilitation. Antony's personality traits, however, do not preclude him from taking responsibility for the crimes committed. Throughout the murders and trial, Antony exhibited a lack of remorse for his actions, further solidifying the fact that he was and remains a danger to society. Both Antony and Jean-Pierre had unhappy childhoods, and ultimately their development was severely impacted. In a twist of fate, these two were brought together and unleashed havoc in a match made in hell. 3 men that we know of were killed, and 1 was left to die as a result of this murderous couple's killing spree that spanned the country. Although the families of the victims will never see their loved ones again, the possibility of both of these individuals being free to roam the streets is ever present. And that begs the question that many ask: is it fair? Should the death penalty still exist? And how do we come to terms with the fact that someone who killed your family member, your friend, your loved one, could be sitting next to you on the train? They could be behind you in the grocery store, or even have the opportunity to take another life. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section. I would love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, my loves, stay safe, stay blessed, and stay the amazing human beings that I'm always hoping you guys are. Bye!